Well, over the next 5 years, legal recreational cannabis sales will impact alcohol and tobacco markets. That's according to the Euromonitor International's new cannabis database. It's believed that recreational cannabis will shoot up to 67% of sales globally by 2025, whereas medical usage of cannabis is predicted to decline. Let's discuss this now with Shane MacGuill. He's from Euromonitor, joining us via Skype this morning. Shane, a very good morning and thanks for your time. So what does this finding actually mean? What is it telling us?
Well, it's telling us that the global cannabis industry is poised for quite rapid growth over the next number of years. Obviously, that growth is primarily centred in North America, in the US and Canada, but we feel that this is a global opportunity and will be spread internationally over time. It's obviously also one that depends very much on regulation and how legalisation campaigns across the world unfold. But we feel, even at a reasonable estimate, that the industry should grow to just about $100 billion by 2025. As you say, the majority of that will be in recreational cannabis, the majority of that driven by the US, but also in markets like South Africa as well.
All right, I'd like to know more about what we were expected to see in South Africa. But before we get there, what are we talking about, or what does this mean when we talk about what impact this is going to have on alcohol and ordinary tobacco sales? Is it telling us that people are now preferring that they are going to go with recreational cannabis rather than getting their jollies, if I were to put it that way, with alcohol and whatever else it is that they're used to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a perfect way of putting it, frankly. I mean, if you look at the way people have managed their moods for a number of decades, I mean, it's been quite blunt in most markets. So in other words, people smoke or they drink to manage stress levels or to get their jollies, as you say. I think what we're seeing now, and if you look again at some of the more well-developed recreational cannabis markets like the US or Canada, it's more common now for people to use cannabis than it is to smoke in some cases, for example. So what we're seeing incrementally is that people are realizing the health effects of tobacco use, are realizing in some ways the negative effects of alcohol use, and are turning towards cannabis as something that they can continue to manage their moods, manage their stress levels, enjoy themselves, but with less repercussions in terms of health outcomes. And societally, I think societies are beginning to recognize that perhaps there's less societal impact from cannabis use than there is from something like tobacco or alcohol use as well.
So essentially, are we gauging that people are looking at this as a healthier choice?
I mean, I think the industry might be slow to describe it as the healthier choice in that sense. I think people don't, there's always a risk when you're using any substance, and people need to understand those risks. And certainly, for example, we wouldn't want younger people to be using cannabis for sure. But I think there is, no question that if you look at the health impacts of cannabis, they appear to be less than combusting tobacco, for example. Even on an individual level, if you look at the effect of alcohol on people's bodies, on hangovers and so on, I think people are realizing that perhaps cannabis is an alternative that is will enable them to achieve the same effects, but with less impactful outcomes in terms of their health.
So what are you seeing in terms of medical cannabis and the declining sales there, the predicted declining sales? Why?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting one, and I think that's again largely a function of the North America here is a centrifugal force in the cannabis industry. Currently, there's a real center of gravity there, and what we expect to see is that medical cannabis sales in the US will decline over the next number of years as more parts of the US move to recreational, and full legalization. So as more people have access to recreational or adult use cannabis, there is maybe less of a necessity for them to seek medical cannabis through those existing frameworks. But, we do expect medical cannabis to incrementally grow internationally. Certainly in Europe, the main categories for growth within the cannabis industry will be medical cannabis and CBD for lifestyle and health and wellness and therapeutic uses. So there is still growth for medical cannabis overall, but there's decline we're projecting in the North American region, which is sort of affecting the overall picture globally.
So, Shane, how big a part do you think that COVID-19 has played in all of this? I mean, in a time where, there was sort of very various levels of lockdown, hard lockdown in many countries where alcohol sales were prohibited, people couldn't get their hands on that, but maybe they were able to get their hands on cannabis for whatever reason, to calm themselves down, or the substitute for alcohol. Do you think that that's going to play a big part, that kind of brought about some kind of more interest in it that might contribute to what you found?
There's no question that COVID-19 and the pandemic has accelerated some of these trends that we've already seen. I mean, again, turning to the US and the Canadian markets, cannabis stores in many parts of those markets were regarded as essential stores, and people were able to continue accessing cannabis through the pandemic, and we saw sales of cannabis rising very rapidly. And I think there's no question that coming out of COVID-19, touch wood for all of us, into next year, more and more people will be looking at cannabis as again, a way to, we go back to the original point, as a way to manage the stresses that they may feel, whether it's coming out of COVID-19 or perhaps additional, insecurity in terms of their economic situation next year. And I think they'll be looking at things like CBD as a substance, cannabis more broadly as a way of managing those moods, perhaps in a slightly more productive way than using alcohol.
In terms of South Africa, are you able to pinpoint any particular findings? I mean, our laws are a little bit blurry at the moment. People are not quite sure, yet you can go out and buy something at a pop-up store in the middle of a major shopping mall. But when it comes to the harder stuff, people are still a bit wary or not quite sure what they're allowed, not allowed to do.
Yeah, well, I think, South Africa is almost a perfect exemplar of how this industry will be driven by the way regulation and legislation unfolds. As you say, there's a little bit of a grey area uncertainty at the moment. We've seen the private use bill this year. We think that if that leads to fuller legalization, and, we think there's a possibility that may happen because of, again, this wider societal perhaps recognition that this is something, that's not as harmful for people or for society, but also in terms of, building an industry around the consumption of this substance as well. So, we think it's possible that legalization in a full way will happen over the next number of years. If that was the case, South Africa would be a substantial global market in terms of consumption. We think somewhere even up to about $1 billion by 2025 or 26, probably slightly less than that, but certainly the potential is there for something of that size. That would make it about a third, let's say, of the tobacco market currently in South Africa. So we think that that's a reasonable proposition. But also in terms of the wider infrastructure of the industry there in South Africa, obviously from a production perspective, there's enormous potential for the production of cannabis, again, whether it be for the domestic market or whether it be internationally. And the more that markets are growing in a global sense, I think the more opportunity there is for markets like that, like South Africa or countries like South Africa, to contribute, not only maybe in terms of production itself, but also trying to develop added value products as well, and kind of be a base of production. There's already, some relatively well-developed and sophisticated companies operating in the South African market on the CBD side. And I think, again, from an international perspective, why not those companies be developing, added value infused products that can go out globally and serve global consumers as well.
Thanks very much for that, Shane MacGuill, Senior Head of Nicotine and Cannabis at Euromonitor International.